Railways and ghost stories oftentimes go hand in hand. Every Thomas fan knows about the ghost train and the different ghost trains that are talked about on Sodor. Even people who aren't fans of Thomas could second that locomotives and old scary stories work their ways into people's ears. At some point, you've definitely heard of either a ghost train or a ghostly encounter at a rail facility. It's written in countless literatures, told through several claimed encounters, and like seen here, popularized in some media. The unfortunate part of most ghost stories is that most of them cannot be proven. 9 times out of 10 just being passed down or told from person to person and at some point making its way online. There are thousands of ghost stories that are related either to trains or involve trains directly. And today we're going to look at one such story that interested me reading and hopefully will interest you all as well. Please keep in mind that nothing I'm talking about unfortunately can be proven. The story itself doesn't even have a proper date, but using context clues I would personally say it took place in the early 1900s. Most ghost stories like this unfortunately don't really have any backing behind them, but that doesn't make them any less interesting. Honestly, in some aspects, I hope this story really is just a story. Imagine with me, if you will, that you recently left school at the age of 14, and you have just got a job as the lowest of the low on the railway. After almost all of the trains have left, large city railway stations can be quite intimidating at night. There may be just enough activity to require at least a basic level of staffing across the hours when it's dark, even in midsummer, but it never is entirely dark. Large, cavernous spaces full of strange shapes can often give rise to strange imaginings. At these times, the only sounds might be the scuffling of rats and mice which emerge at night, and there's always a way into a station for dogs and cats attracted by them. There's a story about 2 young men who reacted very differently to their experiences at night in a large city station. Like I said before, there is no real way to prove this story, but like many stories, there may be a glimmer of truth in it. It's just impossible to say at this point. The young boys, Tom and Bob, started work as lad porters at a large station many years ago, long before it was described officially as job sharing. That is what it was. They worked alternate nights, and their duties consisted of seeing the last passenger trains out in the small hours, then cleaning lamps and other menial tasks until the arrival of the newspaper train at around 3:30 a.m. Their principal task of the night was to unload the newspapers from the train and transfer them into wholesalers' vans. After this, they would close and lock the main gates and extinguish the station lights. They could then retire to the little room besides the goods office, where they built a fire with a bucket full of coal borrowed earlier from a friendly driver, and would set a kettle to boil. There was supposed to be a policeman on duty in the station during the night, but especially in the winter, he was usually inspecting some of the warmer rooms and didn't often get as far as the goods office. This meant that the person that was on duty was often totally alone until the arrival of the day shift a couple hours later. One night, as Tom extinguished the station lights, he thought he saw a shadowy movement near the entrance to one of the platforms. Not unduly worried, he hoisted his lantern and set off to investigate. He found nothing, and brushed off the experience. However, on his way back, he felt a gentle nudge at the back of his knee, the sort of nudge a dog will give you to draw attention to something at which it doesn't want to bark at. Instinctively, Tom would turn around and found himself looking at 2 very large eyes. With a shriek, he ran into the goods office and locked himself inside. When the early turn arrived, they would find Tom a gibbering wreck. He would be taken away by men in white coats and would spend the rest of his life in an asylum. He could often be heard shouting at the animal that had literally frightened him out of his wits when he was a lad. However, the next night, Bob had arrived for duty, having heard about the previous night's going-ons, and he was prepared for what was about to happen. Or, well, as prepared as he could be. After seeing the newspaper away and locking the main gates, extinguishing the station lights, he would walk back to the goods office. However, on his way back to the goods office, he would feel a nudge behind his knee. Bob would then shout at the dog to clear off, which, surprisingly, it seemed to do. Bob at this point would feel as if he was in command of the situation, as well as the dog, and he never experienced any more potentially frightening events. You see, quite early in the history of railways, before the days of industrial injuries and compensation, many large stations would have dogs with collecting boxes, whose proceeds were used to support railwaymen who had been injured at work. It's said that these dogs entered into the spirit of their purpose, and were amiable creatures who might occasionally give a nudge behind the knee of somebody passing them without contributing. Railwaymen and workers would speculate that it was this that caused Tom's freakout. After hearing that story, you're probably wondering what it is specifically that, interested me. I completely and totally agree. The legitimacy of the story is definitely questionable, but it's more what is inside of the story that intrigues me. The sad reality of a 14-year-old boy who would be scared literally out of his own wits is one that's truly terrible, and one that I can only hope is a scary story. But past that, I find the explanations for the dogs as quite dark in itself. To say that these dogs would enter the spirit of their purpose is kinda sad to me, especially when thinking about their overall purpose to the railroad, literally being used for that of handouts, and to then be eternally stuck looking for one that you probably won't get on a station platform. That does not sound like an ideal afterlife to me. And while you can't necessarily prove the afterlife aspect of things, it is worth noting that this was a real practice that the British Railway would employ, not only using dogs for donations, but as station hands and helpers as well. Many preserved bodies of these dogs can be found at museums and stations. While I find nothing wrong with this idea directly, I find something a little bit more wrong with the idea that I would be employed at a rail yard with this being such a problem and nobody would fucking tell me about it. Now, imagining that these dogs would be, as the story described, stuck in their purpose spiritually, forever roaming the station platforms is a sad reality if it were to be one. But if it's such a problem to where railwaymen and workers, they're able to identify what it probably is, and they just don't tell this 14-year-old kid, so he just loses his goddamn mind. That's messed up. And it's that part of things that makes me think that this story probably isn't real. While, again, these practices were employed, I think overall if a similar situation were to have played out, it wouldn't have went down exactly like that. There's just too much for me to personally pick apart for me to really believe in its legitimacy. But with that being said, I would love to hear what you guys think. Do you think this story has any legitimacy? Is there any other scary stories that you think I should check out? Be sure to let me know down in the comments. Also, just so you guys know, this is not a part of my The Real Story series, as this is probably not real, as you can tell. But I do find the ghost stories involving railways and railroads to be intriguing, as I'm sure you all do as well. If you all have any recommendations, be sure to let me know, and hopefully you guys like taking a look at a railway ghost story.